Today's sermon needs to come with a warning label. Pastor's been thinking, reading, studying, debating with colleagues on the subject for a long time, and so the sermon will be a little longer than maybe you're used to, because it's the altar that we discuss. Sacrifices brought to God raises the whole question of the magic blood thing that I talk about. It's like, how can we make any sense of this? How can we make sense? Does it point to any truth at all? Or is it just something that needs to be jettisoned and pushed aside? I'll be talking about the resurrection too in this sermon, and I feel sometimes like I almost need to apologize for it. And that's because in our modern mind, we don't really think that resurrection is exactly possible. And so some people, when they look at the story of the resurrection, they may want to just take it as a story that points towards something that's very real and true. That's one perfectly acceptable way to read it. For others, it may be a real event, something behind it that has some substance. The way I like to put it is I'm convinced on historical grounds, not faith grounds, just historical grounds, that something happened on Easter morning. Not 100% sure what it was, but it had a profound effect on the lives of the people that Jesus had led during his ministry. So as I talk about it, feel free to take it either way. Now I'd like to read to you first from Exodus, the place where God tells the people how to build that altar. And then a passage from Paul's letter to the Romans that talks about the sacrifice of Christ and then talks about our sacrifice. It's chapter 3 and chapter 12, but they really go together very nicely because I've preached on this before. It says, therefore, I appeal to you, brothers and sisters. The therefore is because of, the last 11 chapters. So moving into that is, I think, fits. So would you listen as the Word of God begins to speak to you actively in these texts. Adonai says to Moses on the mountain, you shall make the altar of acacia wood 5 cubits long and 5 cubits wide. The altar shall be square, and it shall be 3 cubits high. You shall make horns for it on its 4 corners. Its horns shall be of one piece with it, and you shall overlay all that with bronze. You shall make pots for it to receive its ashes, and shovels and basins and forks and fire pans. And you shall make all these utensils of bronze, and you shall also make for it a grating, a network of bronze. And on that net you shall make 4 bronze rings as its 4 corners, and you shall set it under the ledge of the altar, so that the net shall extend halfway down the altar. You shall make poles for the altar, poles of acacia wood, and overlay them with bronze. And the poles shall be put through the 2 rings, so that the poles shall be on the 2 sides of the altar when it is carried. You shall make it hollow with the boards that shall be made just as you were shown on our mountain. Paul says to the Roman Christians, but now apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been disclosed and is attested by Torah and prophets, the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who trust. For there is no distinction, since all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. They are now justified by God's grace as a gift through redemption. That is, redemption in Jesus Christ, whom God put forward as a sacrifice of atonement by his blood, effective through trust. God did this to show God's righteousness because in God's divine forbearance, God passed over the sins previously committed. It was to prove at the present time that God alone is righteous. God justifies the one who has trust in Jesus. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good, what is acceptable, what is perfect. "16 dead in Afghanistan. 16 dead. One soldier goes off the rails, and there are 16 dead people in Afghanistan. Now, the story is just beginning to emerge, the struggles and the difficulties that broke this person, but it's not too hard to use our imaginations and recognize that there was a sense for him that the world had betrayed him. The world had not turned out how he expected. Rene Girard, who's an anthropologist of significant influence, calls it mimetic violence. The sense that the world has betrayed us, that others are ahead of us or behind us, and violence erupts out of it until there's a cycle of violence that moves down. I mean, the first murder was really about mimetic violence, the first murder in the Bible, that is. Violence, the cycle. The world betrays, and rage builds in the human heart, and it explodes. It's not like this was the first time. The Hadassah killings in Iraq not too long ago. Again, it's as though this violent impulse within us erupts out of us. The rage overtakes us with this sense of betrayal that has broken our spirit, broken our hearts, broken our lives. It's not just on the battlefield either. One of my preaching students, a young woman, preached a very moving sermon this week, where she told a story. I mean, she had gotten lots of emails a couple of weeks ago, and she was wondering, it was all old friends from her old high school where she had also taught, one right after the other, and as she's reading them, she's beginning to realize that what has happened is a student had come into the school and shot the headmaster. Took place in Jacksonville, Florida. And she struggled to understand how on earth such a thing could happen. The world betrayed the young man. The world had betrayed her, and she was wrestling, trying to understand her own angry response to what was going on. The cycle of violence spins down, and that story is way too common. There have been 71 school shootings since 1996. The world betrays us, and violence erupts, a downward spiral. We put all our hatred and our anger, and we direct it, sometimes towards just one person. Isn't that what the lynchings were about in the 1800s? The world had betrayed us, and the violence that erupts, and we place all our hatred on one kind of person. The lynchings take place. Cyberbullying takes place. Suicides, because people have been attacked online, bullied, torn down because of a sexual orientation. That's the human figure. It's a little more widespread than all this. I'm picking out these isolated news stories, right? But what about the violence against women in intimate relationships? Center for Disease Control says that 1 in 4 women experience abuse at the hands of an intimate partner. 1 in 4. As though the world has betrayed, and the rage wells up, and the men direct the violence at the one that is close, at the one that loves and cares. The cycle of violence moves on down, and it shows itself sometimes not in violent impulse. I'm familiar with actually several spiritual teachers of late who, guilty of sexual indiscretion of one kind or another, have been absolutely crucified on the web. Understand, I'm not defending the behavior. That's not what I mean, but the vituperance and the lack of fairness in the way it's being handled as people just spout out the most hateful remarks, one after another, tearing down instead of seeking anything close to healing. We pour out our anxiety and our rage that is built because we feel the world has betrayed us onto one person. It's always been so. And so society has always found ways, strategies, to be able to deal with this violence, to be able to sublimate it, to control it in some way. And so societies early on found ways to ritualize it. That's what the sacrificial system is all about. Finding a way to place that rage, that disappointment, that horror we feel when the world has betrayed us, not lived up to our expectations. When we have not lived up to our own expectations, we pour out that rage upon the offering that we give. The blood sacrifice, as it were. And we've continued to use those metaphors. The sacrifice, the blood sacrifice that we bring before God so that we can release the rage, release the violent impulse that lives within us when we feel we have been betrayed. Even now we do it symbolically. You know, at least when I was a kid, can't tell you how many times I was told that I needed to put whatever it was about me on the cross with Jesus. Whatever particular moral failing that somebody had noticed I had usually had something to do with fairly natural adolescent impulses. Put that on the cross with Jesus. Get rid of that stuff. Focus on it, and then you will be well, I suppose. But is that where it stands for all of us? Is that really the end for all of us, that we're stuck in this cycle of violence erupting when we feel betrayed? That all we can do is find some way to sublimate it by passing it on in some ritual way? Is that all there is? I went to sort of a symposium on Friday evening over at the seminary. Annette Schellenberg, who's taught here once, has talked her colleagues, 3 of them from time to time, a couple times a year, into just putting on mini lectures, about 20 minutes, 30 minutes apiece, and then some discussion afterwards about a topic. And this time, the topic was the sacrifice of Jesus, the death of Jesus. Does it have meaning or not? Is it something to be rejected or something to be embraced? A fascinating conversation, to be sure. And I asked her at one point, is there any way in which the Old Testament is ambivalent? Is the New Testament ambivalent about this notion of blood sacrifice, sacrifice to an angry God? The answer is all through. Side by side with the writings of the texts about the blood sacrifices are texts like the one in Hosea that says, I want your steadfast love, not sacrifice. I want an experiential knowledge of the presence of God, not burnt offerings. And then, as if with a voice just pure and whole, God speaks in the Gospels and says, I will not accept your sacrifice. Jesus was indeed sacrificed, but sacrificed by human beings who had a need to throw all their hatred and rage upon him. And God didn't want it. As our story goes, God raised Jesus from the dead, as if to say, I do not want your sacrifice. I want your love. And instead, I'm going to give new life in place of the life that you take away with your violence, in place of the hurt and the horror and the betrayal that you feel when you've become a victim. That's the answer of the gospel to all this sacrifice. Tempted to get rid of it, you know. Just remove sacrificial language from our discourse entirely. The metaphor has been damaging all the way through. But I think we can take this one step deeper. Because is the gospel really only about new life for the victim? Is this understanding of Jesus in the Gospels, this interpretation, only about the victim, or can it have something to do with us when we are perpetrator? There are lots of different kinds of sacrifices in Torah. One is this blood sacrifice to an angry God, but to tell you the truth, it's not one that's really high on the list. Most often what happens in Torah is people bring a sacrifice that is intended to draw community together. A person takes personal responsibility for whatever action it is that they've taken to betray the trust of the community around them. They take responsibility for it. They've examined their own lives, and they bring something like reparations into the community. They make an offering as if to say, I will come towards you and seek to behave in a different way. And the truth is that the sacrificial system, the sacrifices that went on day and night around here, was nothing but a huge party. The food was eaten. There was dancing and laughter and joy. It was an opportunity, a feast for people to come together. Thank offerings, offerings to community that sought to heal and draw people together in a whole human community. Now, we don't know how they thought it worked. We don't know the mechanism the ancients had, but for sure that's the direction they were pointing. That whatever offering they brought was intended by God and God was using to draw community together rather than having it split apart, to remove the violence entirely rather than just sublimating it. And so it is that the sacrifice of Jesus can be seen as a communal sacrifice. Outrageous as it may seem, God takes responsibility for the fundamental betrayal in creation. That's what the story's about. Don't we ask time and again, if we have any idea of a God that acts in the world, don't we ask why? Why does God allow this? What's going on that the God of creation would allow this betrayal in the world, would allow this violence in the world? What's going on that God would deal with this negative spiral? God takes responsibility for that and offers God's self in the story as a sacrifice, as a reparation, as the beginning of some move to community coherence and healing. We don't understand what the ancients thought about the mechanism of how that worked, but the story points to a God willing to recognize God's own responsibility and offer the power of healing so that the community can become whole. That's the sacrifice that Paul talks about. And we're called to open our arms and embrace the gift of God that comes. The new life, the freshness a sacrifice that's intended to turn that spiral on its head. And we are called to follow Jesus in this, to offer ourselves as a living sacrifice, to take our own responsibility for the things that we have done to increase that cycle of betrayal, the things that we have done to break apart community. We take our responsibility for those things. We offer ourselves and seek a way to give reparations, a way to help join the community back together. And when we do, we find that the power and the strength of God begins to knit us whole. It's the nature of it. Because as we do, that spiral turns upside down, and the rage and the hatred begin to drain away. And humanity that seems bent on its own destruction can start to heal, start to hope. That's why they call it good news.